Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Fantasy 420, where today we are going to be continuing our early discussion on running backs for the 2019-2020 season. And in this video, we're going to be discussing running backs who I think are early candidates to be tier fallers or droppers for the upcoming 2019-2020 season. Yesterday's video, we had some tier risers. So today, I obviously am going to do what I did in the quarterback video and move on to the tier fallers. I'm going to be using Yahoo.com's last year's top 25 running backs to gauge which running backs finished as a 1 or 2 last year and which ones out of that list I feel are least likely for various reasons to repeat that performance next year. And I just wanted to reiterate, obviously, it's hard to predict based on how early we are in the offseason. We still have draft, we still have free agency, we still have injuries in the preseason and various other things. But that being said, we can still predict based on last year's numbers that it's likely these players might see a drop-off. And without further ado, the first name on this list I'm going to say is Mr. James White for the New England Patriots. He did finish as the 8th running back last year, and he finished with 12 overall touchdowns. And the reason that I don't feel like that is going to be repeated is because last year Sony Michel had 6 overall touchdowns, and I just would expect that number to change into Sony Michel's maybe overall favor. But that being said, I feel like last year James White definitely reached his peak on touchdowns. And when you have a first-round pick in Sony Michel that the team spent last year, he looked really good at the end of the year once he started getting healthy and into the playoffs. I do expect Gronkowski to come back, Edelman, that record to make another run since they made the Super Bowl last year and won it. So I'm not predicting the offense to completely fall off. I do think they will be good, and that production should be around the same. And if I predict Michel to have an increased role, I do think he's going to be that featured back and somebody I'm going to be buying into next year. I'm going to have to assume probably Michel's role is going to be decreased a little bit and probably not as high on him as most people would be going into next year. Granted, I would still like him. I just don't think he's going to finish as that 8th running back or probably a top 12 running back. The next name on the list I'm going to highlight is Chris Carson. I sort of foreshadowed it yesterday when we talked about Rashad Penny, but just like James White, I sort of feel like last year Chris Carson sort of peaked. He finished 15th, and that's with 0 receiving touchdowns. Derrick Henry is the only other name on this list with that little of receiving touchdowns. But that being said, his role is a lot more secure. We know going into next year he's going to be the number 1. We can assume Chris Carson might get that role and probably will. But that being said, he has last year's first-round running back Rashad Penny breathing down his neck, who flashed in a few games, who provides that receiving role. He also had Mike Davis, who looked pretty good at the end of last year. And it's just hard for me to buy into a running back 1 or high-end running back 2 when they're not really going to get those receiving looks at all. Russell Wilson also ended last year with 0 rushing touchdowns. I would expect him to enter this season healthy and dip into that with a few rushing touchdowns. If Penny eats into that, Davis eats into that, Wilson eats into that, or multiple, I just feel like Carson, with him next year not knowing for sure if he's going to be the running back 1, at some point Penny might overtake him. Who knows? I just don't feel like that performance is going to be repeated at all, and I probably would not buy into him in the RB2 range. I would consider him with that 3-headed monster at least. Who knows what they might do in the offseason. I don't see him being an RB2. I would draft him more in the 3 or 4 range, and that's probably not where he's going to go. Next name on the list, a little obvious, but you had to mention him. Adrian Peterson did finish number 17 last year. Rumor has it he wants to re-sign in Washington, and if he does, he will, I believe, be a bit player with his starting role in the NFL being for sure done. I believe Darius Geis will be that starter next year if he signs in Washington. And I'm not going to bet on a Geis injury or the team not doing anything in free agency or the draft besides that for him to be in a starting role. And even at that being the case, he's just another year older. I don't see those flash games like he had last year. And I just wouldn't feel comfortable starting him, likely even in a flex position. He's not a receiver. He's really old. He's not going to be a starter. I wouldn't be comfortable picking him as a running back 3 or 4. I mean, he's going to be like a end of the draft, last pick maybe sort of guy. So I wouldn't even think about drafting him at all. Maybe you might even be able to get him as a free agent at the end. I just would not buy into Adrian Peterson next year. But like I said, kind of obvious, but had to mention him. Next name on the list, Tevin Coleman. He is number 19 running back from last year, and obviously I like to reserve the right to change my mind on this pick. If he signs in Buffalo, he's sort of a LaShawn McCoy clone, and I think that he could do really well with that team, and they would move him into that starting running back role because I think they'd move on from McCoy after this year, and I would like him in Arizona possibly to form a devastating RB combo with David Johnson, and I think that he would get a ton of work next year because they have no receivers or aspirations to probably make the playoffs next year. But that being said, he was already afforded that number 1 running back role finally last year, and we know what we're given at this point with Mr. Coleman, and that was the number 19 running back. And if he signs anywhere else, even if he signed in Arizona, he'd be the number 2 behind David Johnson. And Carolina, same thing. Number 2 behind McCaffrey, receiving back role, and even McCaffrey has that role. Jacksonville, number 2 behind Fournette. New York Jets, 4 running backs, and who knows with Le'Veon Bell. I'm not comfortable drafting Coleman as a running back 1 or 2 when you would need him to be a starting running back to get that number 19 number. And even if he's not that number 1 running back, which I wouldn't project him to sign and be a number 1 running back on a team next year, I just wouldn't project him to overtake that number 1 at any point. I just would project him to stay around that ranking, and I just see him as like very little upside. I wouldn't project him to be an RB1, that's for sure. The only situation I would super buy into him is Buffalo. He might rise above that number 19 ranking, but I sort of just see him as that player that he's going to produce that 100 all-around yards, 8 touchdowns, and on whatever team he's going to be, like I said, he's just going to be limited and that upside is capped. So he's going to be the second last name I'm going to mention, and the last name I'm going to mention is Lamar Miller. He finished number 21 last year, and he is the Texans' starting number 1 running back. A couple days ago, their GM gave a little confidence and said that they would feel comfortable with him as their starter next year. But with that being said, out of all of the other names on the list besides Adrian Peterson, I trust that the least. I just think that the team knows what they have in Lamar Miller at this point. I don't think they can trust D'Onta Foreman to stay healthy, and I think they're going to enter this offseason wanting to get a free agent, draft a high-round running back, and I think that that'll cut into Miller's big games, or have him on a shorter leash. Maybe he doesn't finish the number 1 starter at the end of the season. And I think he's the most volatile name out of all the names. Even like a Tariq Cohen or like a Tevin Coleman, number 2 running back on this list for most teams, I would feel much more confident drafting them over Lamar Miller right now. I just don't see the team really investing heavily in Miller. I don't see his ranking rising above 21, that's for sure. I don't really see him getting 1,000 yards or close to 1,000 yards rushing again this next upcoming season, and I would heavily expect the Texans to reduce his role next year, or at the very most probably he'll produce that. I mean, there's a universe where he produces a really good season. I just don't see that happening, so quite frankly. Anyway, guys, thank you for watching my video today. Those are 5 names that I see as falling possibly for the next upcoming season. Tomorrow we will most likely be back with an NBA midweek video, and I will talk to you then, guys. Take it easy. Bye-bye.